Right, hello, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be having a look at something that came up last week. We were using the well position offset to move vertices around for our terrains, our ground textures. One of the problems that comes from that, just to demonstrate it here, although the vertices are moving, the normals aren't being updated. So today we're going to be looking at how we can use shaders to recreate normals and rebuild that in the shader. So here's the problem. We've got our world position offset. It's just a simple sine wave. I've used the U channel of the UVs to offset my time. Simple sine wave, and then I'm multiplying by the vertex normals and a value, and that's giving me this result of things moving up and down. But you can see here in the reflection there's no update to the normals. So before we get on to some various ways we can do this, I want to talk about what exactly a normal is. So it's the angle of the surface, so that's going to give us the shape, how it's going to be shaded, and that will give us kind of our result. So one piece of math that we'll be using today is the cross product. So I've covered this in previous videos, I believe, but in case you haven't come across the cross product before, it's a vector operation. So the inputs are two different inputs, two different vectors. Let's read the documentation here, it's usually pretty good. Cross product expression computes the cross product of two 3-channel vector values, inputs and outputs resulting 3-channel vector value. Given two lines of vectors in space, the cross product is a line or vector perpendicular to both the inputs. Well, that's all really mathy. What does that actually mean in real terms? If we put in two vectors here, I've got the x direction or red, and then the y direction or green. It'll work out the third orthogonal vector. So here, the cross of red and green give me blue. What does that really mean? If I take in this red vector here, if we look at the gizmo, maybe it's small, but if we look at the x-axis and the y-axis, this is giving us our z-axis. So given two vectors on a plane, we can work out the third one, and that's what we'll be using to calculate our normals. We'll be calculating the sort of directions across and sort of horizontally, and then when we cross them we'll be getting our normals. So don't worry if that doesn't make too much sense, we'll cover it again when it happens, but basically if you imagine your sort of gizmo, your red, green and blue, if you give it any two of those axes, it's going to give you the third one, and that's what the cross product is doing. So first thing I want to have a look at is this solution here. So this is obviously a better result in some regards, so we're getting the different normals of the thing, of the deformed plane, but you can see we're getting these hard faceted edges. So this is using what's called the screen space derivatives. So if I open up this shader here, I'm just going to change it to unlit for a second, so if I can find the right button. There we go. Just to preview what's going on. So there's these two nodes here, ddx and ddy, and we're just plugging in the world position. So we're plugging in the pixel that's being rendered, and it's basically a value of how much that is facing, or it's a value of the slope. So this is the slope in the x direction. So a bit of background for how this is done. When a graphics card renders pixels to the screen, it does it in blocks of 2 by 2, and because you've got multiple pixels within that block, you can check the slope against them, and so that's what this is doing here. So it's not an expensive operation, though you might think it is, because it's something that's already being done on the shader for various other reasons. So this is like I say, a ddx, so this is kind of the slope in the x direction. Obviously ddy is then going to be the slope in the y direction, and if you take the cross product of these two, here we are, we're going to calculate that sort of third orthogonal vector. So that's actually calculating the normal in screen space position, or using the screen space derivatives, it's calculating the world position normal, if that makes sense. And if I just change this back to the normal shader, we've got that cross product plugged into the normals, and we apply this, you'll see it is calculating those normals, but like I say, it's giving us this faceted edges, and this example here where it's facing upwards is correct, or it looks correct, but there's actually a problem. If I rotate this, you can see we're getting these horrible black edges. So there's actually an error in this shader. Here we're calculating these this normal, but we're calculating it in the world space, and by default the input for a normal is in tangent space. So I think we've covered this before as well, but if you take off the tangent space normal, you'll see those errors that were happening before have now gone away. So this might be useful. It's quite an easy thing to do. Obviously, only a few instructions or a few nodes here, but it does have that real limitation. There we are. You can see now it's working correctly for all different angles. But obviously, it's really faceted, and if we're doing something like a sine wave, this kind of faceting really not going to work for us. You could up the number of edges in here, but realistically, you're never going to get a nice, smooth, pixel perfect result. So, so one way we could do it, but not useful really for this example. So, moving on. I didn't save these. So, Unreal actually comes with some functions that can be quite helpful for this. If I open up this material here, we have this function here, normal from height map. Just comes with the engine, normal from height map. Here it is. And if I just preview this, this is going to calculate a normal map from a height map, exactly like it says. I'm plugging in a height map here from the texture. This is the same sort of mud texture from last week. And then you've got some inputs, intensity and offset, and then here it's just telling which of the channels to use. So here this is a RGB that will pack together the ambient, occlusion, the roughness, and the height map. So the height map's in the blue. We're seeing it's probably not the best height map in the world. Maybe needs a bit more. I think I blurred this last week to get a better result for the displacement, and we're getting this banding. So not the best height map. If this was baked from a high to low, it would be a better result. And you'll see here in the normal map conversion, that banding's coming through as well. So obviously, if we're doing this, the quality of the input makes a difference for the sort of normal map we're getting out of it. So, but yes, the height map's here in the blue channel. So this input selector is just telling it to use the blue channel for that. Here we've got a side by side. So we've got the height map being calculated, or the normal map being calculated from the height map on this side and flat on the other. If we just have a look at this in world, this is really quite useful for if we're using the displacement. So I've got down here the same displacement setup as last week. If I start dialing in a little bit of displacement here on this side, it's the same problem we had with the sine wave. So the vertices have been moved. If I go in here in the wireframe, you can see it's got the tessellation. So the vertices have been moved, but the normals haven't been updated. And here we're getting quite a nice realistic result, even with that sort of banding in the normal map. There are inputs for intensity and offset. If I turn that off, it's still giving me the same result there. So you can dial in how much normal you want. Obviously, too much normal is going to start looking bad, but you get a control for that. And then we've got this UV offset amount, and so we'll open this up and have a look in a minute at what that's actually doing. I also have the ability here to blend in the normal map of the mud. So without the normal map on top, you can see there's a huge difference between these two sides. This renders much more realistically here. There's obviously the movement happening. You can see a bit of it in the shading, and the vertices have been moved, but there's no kind of like normal update there. But by the time you've added another normal map on top, blending them, there is a better quality result on this side, but it's not as noticeable. So obviously, if you really want that quality, you want to pay the cost for that in your shader, you can do that, but you don't necessarily need to calculate your additional displaced normals information, because using a normal map is going to hide that anyway. So what exactly is the normal from height map function doing? So we're just going to open this up. It's a little bit of a mess, a little bit confusing. Some of these functions that Epic ship with, I find need a little bit of cleaning up to be understood. So starting here in the middle, we have that input selector. So all these dot products and all this appending the RGB with the A. This is obviously old enough that it was before the RGBA input was available, or output I guess was available. So that's all that's doing is giving us the RGBA appended together, and then we're dotting with this color input just so we can select which of those channels. So because we're probably going to be using a packed height map, so that's kind of what that bit's doing. And we see we're sampling the same texture 3 times. Why are we doing that? Well, actually, we've got this very small offset. So this UV offset value here, we're taking that very small offset value, which is default to 0.005. Here we're appending it to the Y channel. Here we're appending it to the, no, other way around, sorry. Here we're appending it to the X channel. So, in fact, this is the U offset, and then 0, and then here it's kind of, let's think about my terminology a bit more. U, I'm going to do a lowercase d for delta, which is sort of the terminology for small offset. So there's a small offset in the U value, and then 0, and here there is 0 and a small offset in the V value. So the three samples we've got here of our textures, this middle one is unoffset, or not offset. This is the original place where it has, and then these other two textures here have been offset a little bit in U and a little bit in V. Can ignore this. This is just selecting the right channel for us, and then what we're having here is we're subtracting one from the middle, from the other. So here, this is the offset texture. I don't know how easy you can see that if I preview it on the plane here. So this is the height map, and the height map, or the height map not offset, and the height map that's been a little bit offset. And when you subtract one from the other, you get this sort of approximation to light coming in from the side. And the same here with the offset in the other direction. This is an approximation to light coming in from above. So what we've created is two very small offsets, and then because of the distance between those two, and we're taking that direction, we've now effectively created our X and Y, and we can kind of do a cross product and get the normal, or at least an approximation to it. So you can see here, multiplying by an intensity, fine. That's just going to sort of scale it up depending on the strength of the normal that we want, and then we're appending in the red 1, 0, or here appending in 0, 1, and then when we cross them, we get our normal map. So basically, using a very small UV offset to sample the data that's just sort of close to where we want, we're creating those kind of slopes, same as the DDX and DDY were, giving us those sort of those slope angles. Here we're doing it purely using the texture, and we get our result. Hope that makes sense. You don't need to know all the function maths behind it, although obviously it's helpful to do so. I'm not going to change that. I didn't make any meaningful changes, and we can see here. I changed here. Have I done something? I've just lowered my intensity. No, that should be flat on that side. Oh, it's just the displacement. There we go. That's why it doesn't look like what I think it should. Here we go. That second to compile. So now we've got our derived normal map on one side, and our sort of flat normal. Just flatten that out on the other for comparison's sake. And like I say, we've got values for the intensity and the offset. If we had a better texture here, we might need to use a sort of a blurred texture for displacement, or blurred height map for displacement. Stops you getting too many peaks and valleys, but obviously calculating the normals off that, you can see we've got this banding. That's just from Photoshop's blur functions. Not the best. So a nice height map that's been baked without too many sharp corners or sharp edges is going to give you a better result from your normal as well. But that does give us, oops, I go over here, a result that works quite well, considering it's been calculated just using UV offsets. So moving onwards, there is also an alternative. So there's normal from function. This is another inbuilt node. So I started investigating this when I was looking for how to solve the sort of sine wave problem. I always assumed this is sort of took a function input, but no, it's just another way of using height map. And it's set up like this. So here, it's a bit of a funny function. I'm not sure if this has been sort of depreciated, because for a start there's a couple of errors which we're going to get to and fix. But it's kind of two functions in one. So we've got this first half here. We've got our UV input and our small offset. So this is giving us that offset UV X and Y that we need to sort of calculate the directions and the angles. And then that's a set of outputs, and then there's another set of inputs where it's taking data back in. So that texture sampling that was happening in the other function, if I open up the other function, here we are. So this texture sampling here that's happening in the middle, this is now something that we need to set up outside of this function. So we've kind of got the same bit in the input, got the same bit of the output, and then this is then doing that subtraction and then the cross product at the end. So they're very similar functions, or they're sort of doing very similar things. Set up here, so using that same texture, the UV offset in here, take those UVs, then sample your textures outside, and then you plug those sampled textures back into the same function, not the same node, but the same function, and then you can do your intensity and multiply your normal map. So there is a couple of errors. I say, I don't know if this is there's been functionality change to the functions, but you'll notice here this input is looking for a vector 3. If we plug vector 3s into this, it actually just doesn't work at all. Well, why is that? If we open it up, have a look. Here, these inputs, like I say, they're looking for vector 3s. They're doing some math with them that keeps them as vector 3s, we're just adding or subtracting and dividing them, and then they're being appended to the red and the green colours, or red and green directions. And obviously appending a 3 to a 2, you're getting 5. Doesn't know how to cross those things. Should probably give us an error here, but it's not giving us that result. So two things we could do to fix this. First, we could do what I did before, which is take the normal map directly into here. That's going to give us the right result now. Or if we just change these inputs, I find the right function, sorry. If we change these should probably be a scalar, and it should just be the function height map input. And now we're getting a result again. So default obviously isn't to have any data in that. For some reason, if you plugged a scalar in, I would have assumed it would have taken it as a sort of taken that scalar value and put it into all 3 channels of the vector. It doesn't seem to have done that, but probably better to fix these things up. You don't know who's going to be using it. If it says it's looking for a vector 3, but you're supposed to plug in a scalar, well, that's not very good, so change it to a scalar. There we go. This intensity value, this is the thing is broken, or not, doesn't work how I would expect. Intensity of 0, that works, we get completely flat, but a very small value isn't giving us a very small normal. We could always scale it afterwards, we could always sort of play with this after the function, but ideally I'd want this to work as intended. So if we go in here and have a look, there is a input and a multiply sort of floating around. It's currently multiplying by the map offset. Not quite sure what that's doing, but if we compare these two functions, so we say after we've done our subtraction and got the direction vector that we want, then we multiply by a scalar value, and then we append. So we're just going to duplicate that same setup here. So get rid of these 2 new multiply nodes, subtract, multiply by this input, subtract, multiply by this input, and then plug those into our appends, and now our normal intensity value should work as we expect it to. And a small value will give you a small normal, large value will give you a larger normal. Here we go, you see a little bit of distortion happening there. We set that up to 8, which seems to be the default for the other function. We're seeing a very similar kind of result there. So obviously the normal from height map function works. So why would you use this sort of two-tone or two-part setup here? Depends on what the kind of shader you're making is. This it's a bit more of a black box. If you're just doing a normal this sort of ground texture like this, and you want sort of a bit of extra normal from your displacement, then this normal from height map's probably fine. If you're doing something a bit more dynamic, so maybe using 2 or 3 different dynamic puddles and combining all those height maps together and then calculating your normal, done those kinds of things before, this doesn't really let you do that. Yes, you could put in input coordinates, so you could do panning, that could be fine, but having control over the height maps before they get normaled here doesn't really work. So you couldn't have 3 or 4 dynamic height maps, combine them all together, and then run the normal calculation. Whereas here you could have one set of sort of offset generation, then as many texture samples as you like, combine them all as you like into the various height maps. You'd obviously have to keep your different offset streams together, but then you can then plug these in, and it'll do the math for you to sort of combine those offsets and calculate the directions, and then cross product and create the normal. So This is all great, really interesting stuff. Hasn't really solved our problem of the sine wave kind of distorted plane, but now we've done all these and we've got a bit of an understanding of how to do it, we can rebuild the same kind of concept of shader ourselves. So here we are, same shader that we started with. Time, adding the U gradient, so that's just giving us a bit of variation across the plane. Plugged into a sine wave. This is whatever waveform or distortion we want. You could replace this with 3 sine waves or whatever, but a simple sine waves for now. And then I'm multiplying by the vertex normal and the well position. So I'm just getting this kind of distorted waving sine wave. You are seeing some shading here. This is the lighting, so it's not the normals, so it's just kind of like self-shadowing itself. You can see in the reflection it's not changing despite these kind of panels. So firstly, I've only got variation in my sort of x-axis, so I'm only going to do this as sort of a one-way solution first, and then we'll extend that up to a two-way solution. So we need to have a very small offset, normal offset value. I'm going to use the default that Unreal seems to start with, so the 0.005. And we're just going to take this, and what we're going to do is just move it across slightly. So we've taken our time adding the variation. This is giving us that sine wave across our plane. If we just add a little tiny bit, and then plug that into the same sine wave, or the same duplicate of the same function, this is now ever so slightly further along on our plane than the position that we're interested in. And if we do a subtraction, sort of b minus a, this is taking the exact same principle here. So we're subtracting the unchanged value versus the slightly offset value. Then we multiply by an intensity, normal intensity. And I'm just going to set this default to 8 for now. Again, that's the default that Unreal seems to use. And then I can do the exact same thing, just copying this data. So append, well, I can literally actually just copy it. Let's do that. Just copy those 3. We're taking that 1 0 red direction, appending this slight offset value, and then cross. Now we're not doing any variation in our other axis currently, so we don't want to cross with the calculations. We can just cross by a static vector. Now it's a little bit difficult because in this case we want to cross by y. Look at my second monitor there, that's no good for you, is it? Here we want to cross by y because the y is the other vector. We've changed the values in x, and we want to cross by y, but the default plane in the material isn't set up that way. So in fact, I'm just going to take that plane from the scene and plug it in here, and there we go. That will give us the right kind of thing. So we're going to cross by 1 0 1, and that should give us some normal information. Let's give it a sec to compile. There we are. I'll plug that into the normal. So like I say, it's the exact same principle as we've just looked at in the normal from functions and normal from height map. Very small offset in one direction, same function. So in the texture-based example, we're just sampling that texture and it's just been slightly offset. Here we're not sampling a texture, we're using a sine wave, but it's still got that same offset, and then we're appending it with the various axes and then crossing them to get the normal. So then if we just set this normal intensity down, there we are. We can see our sphere is now updating. There does seem to be some banding on that. I'm not sure why. Getting that. Just double check I've done this correctly. So we're doing. Here's my previous thing. So I masked values rather than my normal offset was much smaller. So let's try that. So because we're using a mathematically defined gradient here rather than UVs, we can have an even very, very tiny offset value. Obviously the amount of offset between your pixel being rendered and pixel being kind of calculated, the distance is going to give you different values in there. Still getting a little bit of noise. Is this using? It should be not a tangent based normal map, because again we're calculating that. Bear with me one sec. It's definitely giving me a little bit of, so without any offset. Yeah, didn't notice that before, but it is just a little bit of banding coming from the errors in the offset between the sort of positions. But obviously, because it's a purely mathematically derived gradient, we can go to very, very small values to create the angles. No, apparently that's too small. That's broken the effect completely. Give me a second. Right, welcome back. So I didn't notice this before in my little experiments, but it's actually quite an interesting thing to note. You can see here, I don't know how well it comes across on the video, but we're getting these kind of banding, these individual lines coming across. So if I just untick time and just have like a sort of static wave, just to check the calculations, give it a second. We're actually getting perfectly smooth normal there, and if we change this offset value, you can see it's changing how the kind of normal is being calculated. So, so it's not the calculation step that's causing the banding; it's actually time. And if we plug that in, the values we're dealing with here, they're very small. It's all very sensitive, but time values go up constantly. They keep going up and up and up. So at some point you're dealing with very large numbers and very small numbers, and you get sort of rounding errors. So if I just apply that back and get these banding errors back in again, what we can do is there's an option here in the time. We can set it to a repeating time period, and a time period of 1. All that's going to do is go from 0 to 1, and then as soon as it's at 1, jump back to 0. So it's the same as if we'd put a frac node on our time. And because the way the sine wave works, it repeats over that same time period. We're never actually seeing any discontinuity, any jumps, and that smooths that out, because now the values in here are always staying between 0 and 1, and so we're not getting those rounding errors. And you can see there we're getting that result. So interesting, nice little interesting error that I hadn't noticed before. But hopefully now we can see that we've solved our problem. Our sine wave plane is moving, and it's updating the normals as well as the position, and we're getting our kind of result that we want. So this is obviously only working in a single direction. If we wanted to have sort of a crossed sine wave, something a bit more complicated, it's the same principle. So if I take the same sine wave input and I add a value in the u gradient, and then I'm going to do is I'm going to take another sine wave and just change the period of that one. And then once I've calculated my two deformations, I can add them together. It's going to give me my sort of weird cross waveform. It's not the best in the preview, keeps clipping to the ground. Here the frac is causing problems because we're now not got a same period. Okay, let's just set that back to 1. So you'd have to do time with a different frac if you wanted your sine wave to have a different period, but we will leave that for now. And it's the same thing. So here we want to add a little bit of offset in the other axis. plug in the same sign here. So if I just offset these a little bit, so these two are the same, these two are the same, and then we can do the same functions up here. And we're just going to replace this direction, and it will be this one minus the original, multiplied by our intensity, and we're going to append 0, 1 this time, and cross that. So now we've done the exact same thing as the other functions we're doing. A little offset in x, a little offset in y, the various waveform that's defining the shape in those directions. And if we just apply that and have a look in the world, we should get a two-dimensional wavy shape and that normal updating. In terms of cost, I haven't checked this yet, but if we bring in the original world position offset, so this is just the this the plane without the normal fix, and this is the same plane, admittedly in the two directions, but let's just fix that. Let's just go back in here, temporarily take that out again. So take this and just to give it a fair comparison, I don't want a 2, I want a 3. Not that the additional world position offset is going to be very expensive, but just for the sake of fairness. Oh, not blue. So we have the world position wave and the world position wave with normal fix, and if we compare the two just in the shader complexity graph, when it loads up, it's pretty minor. We're doing everything here with maths, there's no texture lookups, so I can check the numbers. Instruction count here 131, instruction count here 120. So it's me vertical shader as well, so 67 instructions on the vertical shader there, 69 there. So really not a huge additional cost to the material for what is actually a really quite significant visual upgrade. Now obviously this is a perfectly smooth roughness 0, metallic 1 shape, so this is about as reflective and error prone as you could get. If this was something like a water surface, obviously you'd have a scrolling normal map on top, so a bit like here with the terrain shader where we added the normal map on top and you couldn't really see much difference. If this had some scrolling kind of watery normals on top, you might find that you can't see that much of a difference, but good to know. Didn't add too much cost to our shader, and yeah, so hope that was interesting and informative. Sorry for the break, that did create a little bit of extra interest. I didn't notice those errors before. Might be something to do with the recording. Sometimes that does affect how things are rendered for some reason, but either way we found a fix for it. So as long as your time values are kind of repeating over the same period as your waveform is repeating, you're never going to see those changes, never going to see that discontinuity, and you're not going to see those rounding errors. But it might be for the viewing distance you've got in your shader. Doesn't matter anyway. So yeah, as always, questions, comments, etc., let me know. Thank you to my patrons for supporting this. I really enjoyed doing these, so thank you very much for letting me carry on with this, and I will see you all next time.